Imagine standing on a ridge overlooking the Little Bighorn River on a sweltering June afternoon in 1876, watching thousands of warriors move with a precision that would make any European general weep with envy. You're witnessing not chaos, but choreography, not panic, but planning, not savagery, but strategy so brilliant it would be studied in military academies for generations to come. This wasn't a lucky massacre. This was a masterclass in tactical warfare that turned one of America's most celebrated cavalry commanders into a cautionary tale about arrogance, ignorance, and the fatal cost of underestimating your enemy. Before we dive deeper into this remarkable story, I'm curious, which country are you watching from right now? And what time of day is it where you are? Drop your location and time in the comments. There's something powerful about people from all corners of the world, at different hours, coming together to understand a moment that changed history forever. Now, let's walk into that moment together. The man at the center of our story, George Armstrong Custer, was a contradiction wrapped in buckskin and ego. Picture him, long golden hair flowing past his shoulders, custom-tailored uniform, a red scarf knotted at his throat like some frontier peacock. He was 36 years old and already a legend, at least in his own mind and in the breathless newspaper accounts back east. During the Civil War, he'd earned a reputation for audacious cavalry charges, the kind that either won battles or got everyone killed. Mostly he'd gotten lucky, but luck, as any soldier will tell you, is a currency that eventually runs out, and Custer was about to discover he'd been spending far beyond his means. But this story isn't really about Custer. It's about the warriors who faced him, the nations that stood together when survival demanded unity, and the strategic genius that Euro-American military historians would spend decades trying to rationalize away. Because acknowledging the truth meant admitting something uncomfortable, that the so-called savages they'd been fighting possessed tactical sophistication that rivaled anything West Point could produce. The Northern Plains in 1876 were a powder keg of broken treaties and desperate hope. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 had promised the Lakota Sioux and their allies control over the Black Hills, sacred land that held both spiritual and practical significance. Then prospectors found gold, and suddenly white promises became as worthless as the paper they were written on. Miners flooded. The government demanded the tribes sell the land or move to reservations. Many refused. They weren't being stubborn, they were being human, defending their homes, their way of life, their children's future. Among those who refused were leaders whose names should be spoken with the same reverence Americans give to Washington or Lee. Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, Gall, Two Moon, and dozens of others whose tactical brilliance would soon rewrite the rules of engagement on the plains. These weren't reckless warriors drunk on violence. They were men who understood terrain, psychology, logistics, and the art of turning an enemy's strength into a fatal weakness. The winter of 1875-76 had been brutal, and many bands had gathered along the greasy grass, as they called the Little Bighorn River. This wasn't a war camp, it was a city, perhaps the largest gathering of native peoples in generations. Families, children, elders, somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000 people spread across several miles of valley, with perhaps 2,000 warriors capable of fighting. They were there for the spring hunting, for ceremonies, for community. War was coming, they knew, but this moment was about survival and connection. The U.S. Army had other plans. 3 columns were converging on the area, designed to trap the tribes in a coordinated pincer movement. General Alfred Terry commanded the Dakota Column, Colonel John Gibbon led forces from Montana, and General Crook advanced from the south. It was textbook strategy, overwhelming force from multiple directions, giving the enemy no escape. On paper, it was brilliant, but paper doesn't account for pride, impatience, or the kind of fatal ambition that makes a man reach for glory with both hands. Custer commanded the 7th Cavalry, about 650 men, part of Terry's larger force. The plan was simple: locate the village, wait for the other columns to get into position, then strike together. But Custer had spent his entire career building a reputation on bold, independent action. Waiting wasn't in his vocabulary. Sharing glory was even worse. He'd already refused additional cavalry reinforcements and turned down Gatling guns, claiming they'd slow him down. In his mind, he was about to deliver a crushing blow to hostiles who would scatter at the sight of cavalry sabers. He was about to win the West single-handedly, just in time for the nation's centennial celebrations, and maybe, just maybe, a presidential nomination. If you were one of Custer's troopers on June 25, 1876, you'd have been exhausted. You'd ridden hard through the night, following a trail so obvious it should have raised questions. Thousands of lodgepole drag marks, countless hoofprints, signs of a village so large it dwarfed anything you'd encountered before. Your officers were seeing the same signs, but interpreting them through the lens of assumption. Indians always run when cavalry approaches. The bigger the village, the bigger the panic. Size didn't mean danger, it meant targets. This is where the native strategy began, though calling it a single strategy oversimplifies the reality. What happened at Little Bighorn was the result of multiple leaders making independent but complementary decisions. Warriors from different tribes coordinating without formal command structure, and a collective understanding of warfare that emphasized fluidity over rigid hierarchy. European armies moved like clockwork. Plains warriors moved like water, finding the path of least resistance, overwhelming weak points, adapting instantly to changing conditions. When Custer's scouts, including the Crow and Arikara men who knew better, spotted the village from a ridge called the Crow's Nest, they were terrified. They told Custer the valley below held more Sioux than they had bullets. Mitch Boyer, a legendary mixed-blood scout, supposedly told Custer that if he attacked this village, not a man would leave alive. Custer dismissed them. He couldn't see the full village from his position. He saw what he wanted to see: opportunity. Here's where Custer made his first catastrophic error. Fearing the village would scatter, he divided his force into 3 battalions. Captain Frederick Benteen would sweep south to prevent escape and scout for additional villages. Major Marcus Reno would strike the village from the south. Custer himself would swing north, hitting from another angle and trapping fleeing non-combatants. It was the kind of multi-pronged attack that worked beautifully against smaller villages with demoralized defenders. Against a force this size, this organized, this ready, it was suicide in installments. The native strategy didn't begin with battle plans drawn in dirt. It began with awareness, with scouts who'd been tracking the army's approach for days, with leaders who'd gathered to smoke and discuss not if the soldiers would come, but how to meet them. Sitting Bull had recently experienced a powerful vision during the Sundance ceremony. Soldiers falling upside down into camp like grasshoppers from the sky. It was interpreted as a prophecy of victory, but more importantly, it gave the people confidence. They wouldn't run, they would stand. When Reno's battalion, about 175 men, charged the southern end of the village around 3 in the afternoon, the trap began to close, though Reno didn't realize he was the bait. He'd expected panic, women and children fleeing, warriors scattering. Instead, hundreds of warriors poured from the village to meet him. Reno's charge faltered within minutes. The Indians weren't running away, they were running toward him, in numbers that turned his blood to ice water. Imagine you're a trooper in that charge. Your horse is already tired from the night march. The dust is choking, visibility drops to yards. You can hear war cries from every direction, but you can't see the enemy clearly. Arrows fall like rain, bullets whip past. Your commanding officer, who moments ago was screaming about glory, suddenly orders a dismount and defensive line. Then he orders a retreat to the timber. Then he orders a mounted retreat across the river. You've been in the fight for maybe 20 minutes, and already the unit is disintegrating. This was psychological warfare at its finest. The warriors understood that cavalry cohesion depended on momentum and confidence. Break either one, and soldiers became individuals thinking about survival, not victory. Reno's men scrambled up the bluffs across the river, losing nearly a third of their force in the panicked retreat. They'd hold that position for the next day and a half, pinned down and helpless, unable to support anyone or affect the larger battle. They were effectively neutralized without being destroyed. Meanwhile, Custer was moving north along the ridges parallel to the valley, still believing the plan was working. He probably thought Reno's attack was succeeding, drawing warriors south while he prepared to strike the undefended northern end of the village. He had no idea Reno was already shattered. He had no way of knowing that thousands of warriors were now fully mobilized, organized, and moving to intercept him. His communications were limited to couriers, and the terrain made even that difficult. He was blind, moving deeper into a tactical nightmare with the confidence of a man who'd never truly faced defeat. The warriors moving to engage Custer weren't a disorganized mob. They were coordinated groups led by experienced war leaders who understood both their objective and the methods to achieve it. Crazy Horse, probably the most brilliant tactical mind on the plains at that time, understood maneuver warfare instinctively. Gall, who'd lost family members in the initial attack on the village, fought with controlled fury and strategic precision. Two Moon led Cheyenne warriors who'd been fighting these exact soldiers for years and knew their tactics, their weapons, their weaknesses. The strategy they employed was elegant. Fix the enemy in place, surround them, eliminate their mobility, then annihilate them. Cavalry's greatest advantage was speed and shock. Take that away, and you had men with single-shot carbines facing warriors with repeating rifles, bows that could fire faster than any gun, and the kind of courage that comes from defending your family's lives. Custer's battalion, about 210 men, moved along what's now called Battle Ridge. At some point, probably when he saw the true size of the village stretching for miles, Custer must have realized his mistake. But by then, warriors were already moving to cut him off from any retreat. When you study the archaeological evidence found at the battlefield, the spent cartridge patterns tell a story of men taking defensive positions but being overwhelmed from multiple directions simultaneously. This is crucial to understand. The warriors didn't just attack from one side. They surrounded Custer's force completely, something European military doctrine said was nearly impossible against disciplined troops. But it's easier when your warriors are mounted on superior horses, know the terrain intimately, and can communicate through a system of signals that allows decentralized decision-making. No single chief commanded the entire fight. Instead, small groups of warriors responded to opportunities as they appeared, like predators isolating and bringing down prey. If you've made it this far, do me a favor and hit that like button. This story deserves to be heard, and your support helps make sure it reaches more people who need to understand what really happened on these plains. The fighting on Custer's Ridge was brutal and relatively brief. Archaeological evidence suggests the entire engagement lasted perhaps 45 minutes to an hour, though time loses meaning in combat. Imagine being a trooper in that collapsing perimeter. You've fired your carbine until it overheats and jams, you're rationing ammunition, your officers are dying, your horses, held in the center of the defensive position, are being shot down, eliminating any hope of escape. Warriors are firing from gullies and depressions you can't see until it's too late. Some are close enough to count coup, touching enemies with sticks in a gesture of supreme courage before killing them. The strategy here was attrition and pressure. Keep the soldiers contained, never give them a moment to rest or reorganize. Probe for weaknesses, then exploit them ruthlessly. When parts of Custer's line began to collapse, warriors poured through the gaps. Groups of soldiers tried to break out, running for a ravine that might offer cover. They were cut down in the open. The archaeological record shows one group made it into deep ravine, where their last stand ended in close combat. This wasn't mindless slaughter. It was the systematic destruction of a military force that had violated every principle of sound tactics. Custer had divided his command in the face of superior numbers. He'd advanced without adequate reconnaissance. He'd failed to coordinate with his other elements. He'd underestimated his enemy's capabilities, organization, and will to fight. Any one of these errors might be survivable. All of them together were fatal. What made the native victory so complete wasn't just tactical skill. It was the convergence of motivation, preparation, and opportunity. These warriors were fighting for their families, their freedom, their way of life. They had modern weapons, many of them better than the Army's single-shot Springfield carbines. They had intimate knowledge of the terrain. They had leaders who understood warfare not as a parade ground exercise, but as a deadly serious business, requiring intelligence, courage, and adaptability. European military historians for decades tried to explain away the battle as an aberration. They called it a massacre, a term that strips the native warriors of agency and skill. They blamed Reno for cowardice or Benteen for delays, as if Custer's own decisions played no role. They portrayed the Indians as overwhelming hordes who succeeded through numbers alone, ignoring the fact that superior numbers mean nothing without the ability to coordinate and employ them effectively. Alexander the Great had superior numbers at Gaugamela and still required brilliant tactics to win. The warriors at Little Bighorn had both numbers and brilliance. The aftermath of the battle saw the village packing up and dispersing within days. This too was strategic. The leaders knew the army would respond with overwhelming force. Staying concentrated made them a target. Dispersing meant survival. Some bands headed to Canada. Others eventually, reluctantly, moved to reservations as the long, grinding campaign of attrition continued. The victory at Little Bighorn didn't stop the conquest of the plains, but it revealed a truth that American expansion preferred to ignore. The people being displaced and destroyed were neither primitive nor inferior. They were human beings defending their homes with every resource at their disposal, including military genius. In the immediate aftermath, the national response was shock, outrage, and renewed determination to crush Plains resistance. Custer was martyred in the press, transformed from a reckless glory hound into a victim of savagery. The 7th Cavalry's guidon became a symbol of American sacrifice rather than American failure. The actual lessons, the ones about respecting your enemy, understanding terrain, maintaining unit cohesion, and the dangers of dividing forces, were largely ignored in favor of more politically convenient narratives. But military professionals studied the battle intently, even if they couldn't publicly acknowledge all they learned. The importance of reconnaissance, the dangers of assumption, the need for realistic assessment of enemy capabilities, these became quiet lessons absorbed by officers who understood that warfare is warfare, regardless of who's fighting. The tactics used by the Plains warriors influenced cavalry doctrine, though rarely with attribution. Mobility, dispersal, concentration at decisive points, psychological warfare, these weren't new concepts, but seeing them employed so effectively by so-called primitives forced a reevaluation, even if that reevaluation remained largely unspoken. Subscribe to this channel if you want more stories like this, ones that go beyond the myths and hero worship to examine what actually happened and why. History is too important to leave in the hands of propagandists. The strategic brilliance on display at Little Bighorn went far beyond simple tactical execution. It represented a complete understanding of warfare's fundamental principles. Know your enemy, choose your ground, coordinate your forces, maintain morale, exploit weaknesses, and press advantages without mercy. These are the same principles taught at military academies worldwide, then and now. The warriors of the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho nations applied them with a sophistication that destroyed a veteran military force in less time than it takes to watch a football game. Consider the logistics alone. Coordinating thousands of warriors from multiple tribes, each with their own leaders and traditions, without a formal command structure or written orders, in the midst of battle is extraordinarily difficult. It requires shared understanding, mutual trust, and cultural frameworks that allow decentralized initiative within an overall strategic concept. Plains warrior culture had evolved exactly these characteristics over generations of both intertribal warfare and conflicts with Euro-American forces. When the moment came, the system functioned exactly as it needed to. The use of terrain was masterful. The valley of the Little Bighorn offered approaches concealed by hills and ravines, allowing warriors to move without being observed until they were in position to strike. The river itself became an obstacle for retreating cavalry. The ridges where Custer made his stand offered no real advantage because the surrounding terrain provided countless firing positions for attackers. If you were planning a defensive battle and could choose your ground, this valley was perfect. The warriors didn't just fight well here, they'd chosen well. The psychological dimension cannot be overstated. From the moment Reno's charge faltered, the morale dynamic shifted decisively. Soldiers who'd expected easy victory suddenly faced organized, fierce resistance. That shock, that moment when expectation collides with reality, breaks men's spirits faster than bullets break their bodies. The warriors, meanwhile, were fighting with the clarity that comes from existential threat. There was no confusion about stakes. Lose this fight, and your children lose their future. That kind of motivation makes men dangerous in ways parade ground soldiers can't match. The weapons employed also tell a strategic story. Many warriors carried repeating rifles, Winchester and Henry models that allowed rapid fire. The Army's Springfield carbines were single-shot weapons, requiring manual reloading after each round. In a static defensive position with good supply lines, that's manageable. Surrounded, low on ammunition, facing enemies who can fire 7 or 8 rounds to your 1, it's catastrophic. The warriors had acquired these weapons through trade, capture, and purchase. They'd made strategic decisions about armament that gave them tactical advantages at the crucial moment. Even the decision about when to break off the attack showed strategic thinking. After destroying Custer's immediate command, the warriors could have overrun Reno and Benteen's positions on the bluffs, though it would have cost more casualties. Instead, they maintained pressure, kept the soldiers pinned and demoralized, but didn't waste lives on unnecessary assaults. When word came that more soldiers were approaching, the village packed up and moved. The objective wasn't to kill every soldier, it was to defend the people, and that meant knowing when to fight and when to preserve strength for future battles. The diversionary tactics employed were sophisticated. While some warriors engaged Reno, others were already positioning to intercept Custer. This required communication and coordination, knowing where different elements of the enemy force were and assigning groups to deal with each threat. It's the kind of operational level thinking that separates competent fighters from military strategists. The warriors at Little Bighorn operated at this higher level of warfare, seeing the battle as an interconnected whole rather than isolated skirmishes. The aftermath strategy, the dispersion and evasion, was equally sound. The leaders knew they couldn't hold territory against the full might of the U.S. Army. Victory didn't mean establishing a static defense, it meant surviving to fight again, protecting the people, maintaining the struggle for as long as possible. It was a strategy born of realism about their situation and the long-term nature of their resistance. They weren't trying to win a conventional war, they were trying to make conquests so costly that maybe, somehow, the invaders would negotiate in good faith. Of course, that didn't happen. The response to Little Bighorn was escalation. More troops, more aggressive campaigns, more pressure on the reservations, more broken promises. Within a year, most of the bands involved in the battle had surrendered or fled to Canada. Crazy Horse would be killed while in custody. Sitting Bull would eventually return from Canada and also meet a violent end. The way of life they'd fought to preserve would be systematically destroyed through policy, violence, and cultural genocide. But the battle itself stands as a testament to what's possible when people fight with skill, courage, and unity for something worth fighting for. It's a reminder that military excellence isn't the exclusive property of any nation or people. Warfare is a human endeavor, and humans everywhere, when pressed, can rise to extraordinary levels of capability. The warriors at Little Bighorn weren't lucky, they were good. Better than their enemy on that day, in that place, under those circumstances. The strategic lessons ripple forward through time. Never underestimate an opponent. Arrogance is a force multiplier for your enemy. Divide your forces at your peril. Know the ground. Respect intelligence that contradicts your assumptions. Maintain unit cohesion. These principles are written in blood across battlefields throughout history, but somehow each generation of leaders seems to need to learn them again. Custer learned them too late. The warriors who fought him had already internalized them through a military culture that valued proven competence over political connections or self-promotion. There's a deeper lesson here about narrative control and historical memory. For generations, the story of Little Bighorn was told as tragedy and martyrdom, with Custer as the hero and the native warriors as villains or at best faceless obstacles. That narrative served political purposes, justifying continued aggression and framing conquest as righteous destiny. Only in recent decades has a more complete understanding emerged, one that acknowledges the agency, intelligence, and military skill of the people defending their lands. The battle's influence on Native American military resistance was complicated. In the short term, it emboldened resistance and demonstrated that victory was possible. In the longer term, it galvanized U.S. military response and probably hastened the final conquest of the plains. But it also ensured that the story of that conquest would include this moment of undeniable Native military superiority, this proof that the outcome wasn't inevitable or foreordained, but rather the result of specific decisions, resources, and circumstances. The tactical innovations on display would influence warfare beyond the plains: mobility, dispersal, concentration at decisive points, the use of terrain for concealment and advantage, psychological operations aimed at breaking enemy cohesion. These became standard elements of modern warfare. While military historians rarely credit plains warriors directly, the principles they demonstrated with such devastating effect at Little Bighorn can be seen in conflicts from the Boer War to Vietnam to modern counterinsurgency doctrine. What strikes me most about this battle, studying it years later with access to archaeological evidence, oral histories, and military analysis, is how completely the conventional wisdom was shattered. Everything the Army thought it knew about Indian fighting proved wrong on that June afternoon. Every assumption about Native military capabilities was revealed as prejudice rather than analysis. Every confident prediction about how the engagement would unfold proved catastrophically inaccurate. And yet, rather than learning the lesson about the dangers of cultural superiority and assumed dominance, the response was to double down, to attribute the defeat to anything except the unpalatable truth that they'd been outthought and outfought. If you were a young warrior riding back to camp that evening, exhausted, probably wounded, having seen friends die, but also having achieved an impossible victory, what would you have felt? Relief? Pride? Grief for the fallen? Fear about what comes next? Probably all of it, the complex stew of emotions that follows any battle. But maybe also satisfaction, knowing that you'd defended your people successfully, that you'd proven what many doubted, that you could stand against the bluecoats and win. And if you were one of the survivors on Reno's hill, having heard the distant gunfire fade to silence from Custer's direction, knowing what that silence meant, what filled your mind through that long night? Guilt at being alive when comrades weren't? Relief at survival? Anger at the leadership that put you in this position? Terror that tomorrow might bring your turn to die? Combat doesn't offer simple emotions. It offers complexity that haunts men for whatever life remains to them. The archaeological work done at the battlefield in the 1980s and beyond has added layers of understanding impossible for earlier historians. The pattern of cartridge cases, the ballistic evidence, the artifacts recovered, all paint a picture of how the fight unfolded with far more accuracy than survivor testimony alone could provide. It confirms the rapid collapse of Custer's position, the overwhelming nature of the attack, the desperation of the final moments. It also confirms the tactical sophistication of the assault, the coordination required to produce the patterns of evidence we find.
One of the most poignant aspects of studying this battle is recognizing the individual lives caught up in forces beyond their control. Young troopers, many of them immigrants seeking a better life, who joined the Army for steady pay and ended up dying in a dry Montana valley for a cause most of them probably didn't fully understand. Warriors fighting for everything they held sacred, knowing even in victory that the larger war was being lost, that time and numbers weren't on their side. Families waiting for husbands, sons, fathers who would never return. The human cost of conquest can't be measured in just the bodies that fell that day, but in the generations of trauma that rippled outward. The strategic brilliance of the native forces at Little Bighorn didn't prevent the ultimate tragedy of Plains conquest, but it ensured that the story couldn't be told as simple inevitability or manifest destiny. It forced acknowledgement, however grudging and delayed, that the people being displaced possessed every human quality their conquerors claimed, including military genius. That acknowledgement matters. It matters for historical accuracy. It matters for the descendants of those warriors who deserve to have their ancestors' achievements recognized. It matters for understanding that history is made by human choices, not abstract forces or divine plans. As we close this story, I want you to consider something. History is full of moments where conventional wisdom, cultural prejudice, and assumed superiority collided with reality and shattered. Little Bighorn was one such moment. The warriors who fought there weren't making history in the abstract. They were making decisions based on the information available to them, using skills honed over lifetimes, fighting for reasons that made perfect sense in their context. They won, not through luck or savagery, but through superior strategy, better knowledge of terrain, effective coordination, appropriate weapons, and the kind of motivation that turns ordinary men into legends. What can we learn from this? That underestimating people different from ourselves is dangerous, that military excellence has no racial or cultural boundaries, that courage and skill deserve recognition regardless of which side of history you find yourself on, that the comfortable narratives we tell ourselves about the past often obscure uncomfortable truths we need to confront. I'll leave you with a question to consider, and please share your thoughts in the comments below. If the warriors at Little Bighorn had modern weapons and comparable numbers in every engagement with the U.S. Army, how different might the history of the American West have been? Not whether they would have ultimately won. The demographic and industrial advantages of the United States probably made that impossible. But how much longer might they have maintained their independence? How many more years of freedom might their children have known? And what would that have meant for negotiations, treaties, and the final terms of peace? The Battle of the Little Bighorn wasn't just a military engagement. It was a moment when two worlds collided, when strategic brilliance met arrogant certainty, when courage faced down overwhelming long-term odds for a brief, shining victory. The warriors who fought there deserve to be remembered, not as savages or villains, but as soldiers who understood their craft and executed it with excellence. The strategy that destroyed Custer wasn't luck. It was war fought well by people who had every reason to fight and every right to defend themselves. Thank you for staying with this story to the end. The fact that you're still here tells me you understand that history isn't just dates and names, but human experiences that echo across generations. If this changed how you think about the American West, about Native American military capabilities, or about the nature of warfare itself, then we've accomplished something meaningful together. Until next time, remember that every battle has multiple perspectives, and truth is usually more complex and more interesting than the simple stories we first learn.